A promise, I'm back. Good evening once again. Welcome in today's video where we are going to be looking at what we call the mid-sagittal section of what we call the brain. If it is your very first time to watch me, please make sure you subscribe. You put on the notification bell such that whenever I load the video, you become the very first person to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at the practical part of the different parts that make up what we call the brain. So we have brought this model which is going to be now showing the mid-sagittal section of what we call the brain. Okay, so let's see these parts which make up what we call the brain. Okay, and of course the brain is going to be having three main parts. It's going to be having the whole of this part here. Okay, the whole of this part here, the whole of this one here. The whole of this one is what we call the cerebrum. And of course, the cerebrum is going to be one of the largest parts of the brain. Okay, so now that's going to be our first main part of the brain. Okay, and then we also have this part here, which is going to be 20, 21, and then 22. Okay, so now the whole of that part is what we call the brain stem. Okay, is what we call the brain stem. It's going to be now our second part of what we call the brain. And then we also have this last part, which is like a leaf-like structure at the back of what we call the brain stem. This structure here is what we call the cerebellum. Okay, is what we call the cerebellum, and is super very important in coordinating movement and even also maintaining what we call posture. Okay, so now generally those are the three parts that make up what we call the brain. So let's go ahead and dig inside and see all these internal parts that make up what we call the brain. Okay, now when we come on the lateral sides of what we call the cerebrum, we are going to be having what we call the gray matter. Okay, so now the gray matter, which is going to be located on the lateral sides of the cerebrum, is what we call the cerebral cortex. Okay, is what we call the cerebral cortex. Okay, and of course the cerebrum is going to be having two parts. It's going to be having the telencephalon, which is going to be the more especially in the outer parts, and then the what we call the diencephalon, which is going to be located in the deeper areas. Okay, so now those are the two parts that make up the cerebrum, the telencephalon and then even what we call the diencephalon. Okay, now when you see the whole of this band of the white matter, one of the most largest commissural fiber, this number 7. Now the whole of this number 7 is what we call the corpus callosum. Okay, is what we call the corpus callosum, and it's going to be helping in the communication between the cerebral hemispheres, because the cerebrum is going to be having two cerebral hemispheres. We have the right and then the left. So now we have this band of the white matter that's going to be helping in the communication and connection between the two cerebral hemispheres. That's what we call the corpus callosum. Very important. Okay. Now, when you come to number 8, you see this number 8. This number 8 is going to be one of the most important thin membrane that's going to be separating the two fluid-filled cavities located within the brain. You know, the brain has what we call fluid-filled cavities. We have what we call the lateral ventricles, which are going to be the largest ventricles of the brain, going to be housing what we call cerebrospinal fluid. Now, you're going to be having these lateral ventricles located within the telencephalon, and you're going to be having one in each hemisphere. Okay, meaning that you're going to be having two lateral ventricles. Now, these two lateral ventricles are going to be separated by this thin membrane, which we call the septum pellucidum. Okay, so now this number 8 is what we call the septum pellucidum. Okay, separating the two lateral ventricles. Now, when we come to number 9, this number 9 is also going to be very important. What we call the phonics is what we call the phonics, and it's going to be aiding in what we call connection of the different parts that make up what we call the limbic system. Okay. And of course, the limbic system is going to be having very many structures, the likes of the amygdala, which is responsible for fear and different kind of the emotions. The hippocampus, that's going to be for memory consolidations. We have what we call the thalamus. We have what we call the hypothalamus, the cingulate gyrus, and the phonics. There are very many structures that make up what we call the limbic system. Okay. So now that was number 9, the phonics. Then number 10, you see the whole of this tissue, which is super very important. This number 10 is what we call the choroid plexus. Okay, it is very important in secretion of what we call the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Then when we come to number 11, the whole of this structure which looks like an egg, this egg-like structure is what we call the thalamus. Okay, what we call the thalamus, and of course you're going to be having the two thalamus, of course, going to be now what we call the thalami, and they are going to be connected together by what we call interthalamic adhesions. Okay, have that kind of the dilated structure is called the interthalamic adhesion, connecting the thalamus, the two thalami together. And of course, in between these two thalami, we are going to be having again another fluid-filled cavity, which we call the third ventricle. Okay, so we are going to be having between the thalami, the third ventricle, which also secretes the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, that's number 11. When we come to number 12, you see this kind of number 12, one of the bunch of what we call the white matter, these bundles. This is what we call the anterior commissure. Okay, so what we call the anterior commissure, and it's going to be aiding in what we call communication of the different parts of the brain, more especially what we call the two temporal lobes. Okay, so this is going to be the anterior commissure. When we come to number 13, this number 13 is going to be one of the crossing area of what we call the optic nerve. So now this number 13 becomes what we call the optic chiasm. Okay, this 13 is what we call the optic chiasm. Okay. And of course, when we come to number 14, this number 14 is going to be one of the most important, beautiful glands. So this number 14, the whole of this one is what we call the pituitary gland. Okay, and this pituitary gland is going to be seated in this kind of invagination. You see this kind of this invagination where our pituitary gland sits is what we call the sella tachyca. Okay, is what we call the sella tachyca, and it's going to be aligned by what we call the dura septa, and this kind of the dura septa that lines this fold, the whole of this sella tachyca, is what we call the diaphragma sella. Okay, and of course this pituitary gland is going to be having two parts, the posterior part and then also what we call the anterior part, secreting different kind of hormones, which also goes and stimulate other hormones to produce different chemicals. Okay. And then of course you're going to be having above what we call the pituitary gland, we have this part which is called number 18. You see the whole of this part here. This part here is what we call the hypothalamus. Okay. Number 18 is what we call the hypothalamus, and this hypothalamus is going to be very important in what we call control of autonomic functions, what we call the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and even what we call the parasympathetic nervous system, regulation of what we call temperature, regulation of what we call thirsty, osmolarity of blood. So now this structure is super very important in regulating autonomic functions. And of course, this hypothalamus is going to be having this kind of the connection with the pituitary gland. You see this kind of this connection between the hypothalamus and then the pituitary gland. This structure here is what we call the infundibulum. Okay, and this kind of the infundibulum is one which is going to be helping and communication between what we call the hypothalamus and what we call the pituitary gland. Okay. So now when we come to number 16, you see the whole of this structure here, number 16. So now this number 16, what we call the posterior commissure. Okay, is what we call the posterior commissure. Then when we come to number 15 here, you see this 15 here is super very important at the back of what we call the thalamus and then also the fornix. This is what we call the pineal gland. Okay, is what we call the pineal gland, and is super very important in producing one of the important chemical that regulates sleep-awake cycle, which we call melatonin. Okay, this pineal body releases what we call melatonin that regulates sleep-awake cycle. Super very important. And then when we come here, the whole of this number 20, you see this number 20, this one is what we call the midbrain. Okay, is what we call the midbrain. And then when we come to number 21 here, this 21 is what we call the pons. Super very important. This is what we call the pons. And then when we come down number 22, okay, this number 22, the whole of this area is what we call the medulla oblongata. Okay, is what we call the medulla oblongata, and of course the medulla oblongata is going to be stopping at what we call the foramen of magnum, and then from that it's going to be transitioning in what we call the spinal cord. Okay, so now this structure number 23 is what we call the spinal cord. It's going to be starting from the foramen of magnum and moves all down the vertebral column until it ends in what we call between L1 and then L2 where it ends. Okay, this is super very important. Okay, Again, when we come at the back of what we call the midbrain, you see the whole at the back of the midbrain, we have these two dilated structures. Have these two bumps. You have the one which is going to be on top, and then another which is going to be just below. These structures are what we call the colliculi. The one which is on top is going to be what we call the superior colliculi, and then the one which is below is what we call the inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi is going to be aiding in what we call visual reflexes, and then what we call the inferior colliculi is going to be aiding in what we call auditory reflexes. They are all going to be part of what we call the midbrain. Okay, we're going to be having a certain part we call the tectum within what we call the midbrain. Okay. And then when we come to this part number 17, this the whole of this sac. Number 17 is what we call the cerebellum. Okay, going to be having the cerebellum, and it's also going to be having what we call the gray matter. Okay, it's going to be having the gray matter, and of course the gray matter within the cerebellum is what we call the cerebellar cortex. Okay, cerebellar cortex, and of course you're going to be having these center bundles of the white matter. Okay, these center bundles of the white matter is what we call the arbor vitae. Okay, what we call the arbor vitae, the white matter within the deeper parts of what we call the cerebellum. Okay. And then you see this part number 19. This part number 19 is going to be one of the fluid-filled cavity, and it's going to be located between these two structures. You know this structure number 20, 21, and then 22, the whole of those structures is what we call the brain stem, consisting of the midbrain, pons, and then medulla oblongata. Now, between the brain stem and then the cerebellum, we have this fluid-filled cavity which we call the fourth ventricle. And that is within this fourth ventricle that our cerebrospinal fluid is going to be exiting into what we call subarachnoid space. We'll have two openings where cerebrospinal fluid passes. We have three of them, the two lateral apertures and then one median aperture. The two lateral apertures are what we call the foramen of Lasker, and then also what we call the foramen of Magendie. Okay, the two foramen of Lasker and then one foramen of Magendie. Those are the exit points of cerebrospinal fluid into what we call the subarachnoid space. And of course, you're going to be having cerebrospinal fluid coming from these the bigger lateral ventricles located in the telencephalon, and of course they secrete their cerebrospinal fluid which flows down to what we call the third ventricle, which is going to be located in between the thalami. And of course, there's going to be a very important connection between the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle, which we call the foramen of Monro, or what we call interventricular foramen. Okay, but the simple word to use what we call the foramen of Monro. So now, even also this choroid plexus within the third ventricle also secretes cerebrospinal fluid, which also moves down to the fourth ventricle through this canal. So this canal, which is going to be located in what we call the midbrain. You know this canal which is connecting the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle? This is what we call cerebral aqueduct. Okay, this is what we call cerebral aqueduct, allowing the flow of cerebrospinal fluid from the third ventricle, which is located between the thalami, down into what we call the fourth ventricle. From there, where it exits, and then it goes into what we call subarachnoid space. From there, now it starts circulating, bathing all the brain and then the spinal cord. Okay. Then we have a very important structure just above the corpus callosum. We have these very long gyri. We have what we call these bumps, these kind of dilated structures. These elevations are what we call the gyri. And then this kind of the deep regions are what we call the sulcus. So you're going to be having gyri, sulcus, gyri, sulcus, gyri, sulcus, gyri, sulcus. So now this kind of the gyri, which is just very next to what we call the corpus callosum, super very important, the whole of this gyri. This is what we call the cingulate gyrus. Okay, is what we call the cingulate gyrus. Super very important, and it's going to be part of what we call the limbic system. Okay. And then again, we have this this structure here just in front of the midbrain. This structure here is what we call the mammillary body. Very important in what we call memory processing. Super very, very important. And of course, we have said that you see this the sinus, what we call the sphenoid sinus. And in case someone has what we call the tumor of the pituitary gland, this is going to be one of the entrance port to correct what we call the tumor of the pituitary gland, what we call the transsphenoidal surgery. Okay, the transsphenoid surgery, the doctors are going to be passing this area to access the pituitary gland, and then they correct what we call the pituitary tumor. Okay, so now this briefly covers the internal parts of what we call the mid-sagittal of the brainstem. And if you think it is making sense, please like the video, comment down in the comment section, and then subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until we meet next time.